the M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, the M1 carbine. What do all of these have in common with one another? Well, if you're versed in World War II history, you'll know that they were some of the primary rifles used by US forces throughout the conflict. However, did you know that many of them continued use into the 1960s? But what happens when those weapons start being replaced with newer ones? You'd think just a more effective soldier or marine and a more deadly weapon. Well, you'd be correct in one regard, however the other one being a complete and total overhaul of the webbing and load-carrying system that often accompanied them. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the United States' first post-war equipment system, the M1956 LCE, or Load-Carrying Equipment System. The end of the Second World War brought about a large number of changes, be it political, economical, and certainly geographical. Things were really shaken up. However, as the 1940s gave way to the 50s, the United States found itself facing another conflict, the Cold War. Though it was called the Cold War as it was more of a war of ideology, strategic planning, and a whole lot of tension, it did flare up into full-scale conflicts, the Korean War being one of the earliest. Beginning in June of 1950 and ending in July of 1953, this chapter of the Korean conflict, which had been ongoing since 1945, saw North Korea invade South Korea, driving its forces all the way to the southern region of Busan. However, as the year drew to a close, a large number of US and UN forces arrived and began to, with the help of the South Koreans, push the KPA, or Korean People's Army, back north. Over the next few months, ROK, short for Republic of Korea, US and UN forces would be in a back-and-forth conflict with the KPA and China's PVA, or People's Volunteer Army, until midsummer of 1951 when the conflict entered a sort of stalemate along the 38th parallel. For the next 2 years, the two sides found themselves gaining little ground against one another, and by 1953 an armistice was agreed upon and signed by representatives of the UN, US, North Korea, and China. Though it technically ended the war, it did not end the conflict, which still continues today. So why did we bring up that little history lesson? Well, it was the US's first real war after World War II and more or less showed how capable they were in the new era. Seeing such a large force in the 1940s, the US military was scaled down from a wartime one but remained active throughout Europe, Asia, and parts beyond. With only 5 years in between conflicts, there wasn't a whole lot as far as advancement in infantry-based weaponry or equipment. In fact, US forces continued to use the same weapons such as the M1 Garand, the BAR, the M3A1 grease gun, and M1 carbine they had used to fight Japan, Italy, and Germany only a few years prior. This essentially meant that the same equipment that was used alongside them during the 40s was right there with them in the 50s. Now, it's worth noting that the US military had been playing around with updating the M1 Garand as early as 1942, seeing a series of modifications which experimented with the cartridge sizes, switching from an en-bloc clip to a detachable magazine, selective fire, and so on. The Korean War pretty much was a tipping point for the rifle as it had really begun to show its shortcomings. Though effective, its heavy weight, small round capacity, and slower rate of fire in between reloads, along with a lack of selective fire mode, began to cause more problems. Additionally, with the ever-growing threat of communism, specifically with the Soviet Union, the US began to overhaul and upgrade their military on many levels. One of the most significant came by way of the search for a new rifle. This was kicked into high gear when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, suggested trying to standardize the rifles of all its member nations' armed forces to allow for easier logistics in the event of a large-scale war breaking out. With a number of rifles being prototyped and fielded from Remington, Clark Arms, the Springfield Armory, Fabrique Nationale, among a few others, there were a lot of moving parts. This in turn caused a bit of a problem for the team in charge of updating uniforms and gear, specifically load-carrying equipment. Now, during Korea, troops continued to use items such as the M1944 suspenders, M1936 pistol belt, M1923 cartridge belt for Garand en-bloc clips and carbine magazines, M1937 BAR magazine belts, M1910 canteens, M1945 haversacks, and so on, as their designs corresponded with most of those weapons as far as storing magazines, en-blocs, and so on. However, with the NATO trials seeing a variety of rifles being tested that often featured different sized magazines, nothing could really be solidified until the rifle was. That didn't stop the US Army's Quartermaster Research and Engineer Laboratories though, also known as Natick Labs, which had begun researching and developing a new load-carrying system during the early 1950s. They had been playing around with not only the size and shape of things like pouches and how to attach them, but also how much the average wearer could carry on themselves and how to properly distribute it. They had had determined that the average wearer could handle about 45 pounds, or 20.4 kilograms, into the field for all their needs. 25 pounds, or 11.3 kilos of gear for direct combat purposes, which would be worn on the body and pack, and 20 pounds, or 9.1 kilos, for secondary items such as bedding and toiletries by way of a cargo pack or by other separate means. Enter the EX-54 system. Trialed by the QMC or Quartermaster Corps, these experimental pieces remain something of a mystery because of their lack of documentation and limited field use. Likely an abbreviation for Experimental 54, after it being a prototype system potentially tested in 1954, these early pieces took a somewhat different approach to how pouches and webbing worked. Starting at the top, there were new suspenders, belt and buckle systems, pouches, one large and one small, entrenching tool covers, combat packs, and canteens, to name a few. It was the first attempt to create a fully modular system which would allow for customization based on wearers' needs, the environment, objectives, and so on. With warfare evolving, leading to a rise in aerial and mechanized infantry, along with more hybrid warfare that could sprout up anywhere from the remote jungles of Asia to the urban centers of Western Europe, the US wanted to create a system that could be adopted for all sorts of scenarios, equipment, and weaponry. Every piece was marked with QMC, then EX-54, followed by a secondary number which was likely a coding system to identify certain pieces and the differences between them. However, the most important element that came out of the system was their new method of attaching everything. Up until then, the means of securing separate items was done by metal hangers, often referred to as wire hooks or M1910 hooks, that fed into eyelets found along the belt. Though it worked well, the main issue came down to two things. Attaching and removing items wasn't always easy and sometimes required taking off the belt. And once the item was attached, it would hang freely from the belt, leading to it swaying and bumping up against the wearer. During testing of the EX-54, two different styles of clasps were seen. Known as slide closures or fastening devices, the first was spring and tension based, and the other was a simple slide closure. These two versions would slot on the back and see their clasp section go around a belt or loop and securely fastened to it. It's a bit hard to denote exactly how widespread these were as far as actual issue and use, but judging by their relative obscurity, it's a safe assumption they were seen in very small numbers. Now, we'll get into the nuances of most of these prototype pieces alongside their M1956 counterparts shortly, as it'll just be less confusing that way, but just know that the EX-54 was not adopted, however quite a bit of it was rolled over into the M1956 system. Anyway though, remember the NATO trials from earlier? Well, come 1954, the contenders for a new rifle essentially whittled down to two. The T-48, a redesigned US copy of the FN-FAL, and the T-44, one of the many upgraded prototypes stemming from the M1 Garand, both of which featured detachable box magazines. With both magazines coming in close to 6 inches or around 15 centimeters at their longest point, the final nail of the older systems had been firmly hit into the coffin, as the largest belt pouch, that of the BAR, only held magazines up to 5.7 inches or 14.5 centimeters. But to finish off our abridged rifle adoption story, the T-44 was selected, even though it scored almost the same as the T-48. There were a few reasons it was chosen, one of which was it being slightly lighter. By 1957, it had gained the designation of M14 and would go on to cause the slow decline and eventual retiring of the M1 Garand, M1 and M2 carbines, M3A1 submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle. On a side note, another rifle that had gotten close to competing against the T-44 and 48 was an early iteration of the AR-10. However, after its barrel blew up during a 1956 test, it was withdrawn, but did see renewed interest later on, and after a bit of reworking by the creator Eugene Stoner, eventually led to the M16, which in turn helped lead to the M1956's replacement. A little foreshadowing there, but back to our story. Now, having a better idea of what they were working with, Natick Labs ramped up development on the new load-carrying system. Having the knowledge gained by the EX-54 trials, the M1956 LCE slowly began to take shape. Come March of 1957, the system had been officially adopted and was given the name the M1956 Individual Load Carrying Equipment, or ILCE, though many often referred to it as simply LCE. By the end of the 1950s, it would see full-scale issue throughout the Army, with it occasionally being used by many of the other branches in the following years. The primary components consisted of a pistol belt, suspenders, first aid or compass case, universal ammunition pouches, 2 by default, an entrenching tool carrier, field pack, canteen cover, and sleeping bag carrier. Secondary items that weren't as widespread or came a little later were the field pack adapter, M16A1 ammunition pouch, and a universal individual load-carrying sling, which, although not technically a part of the M1956, was introduced with it. The way many of these items were secured was by way of the second model's slide keeper seen on the EX-54, which shrunk down in size. These devices would continue to be the primary attachment method through the turn of the century on all following LCEs until its replacement with the MOLLE system. They are now often referred to as Alice clips due to their prominence with the more widespread and used Alice, or All-Purpose Lightweight Individual Carrying Equipment System, which was introduced in 1975. But come the mid-1960s, the US military began its large-scale ground operations inside of Vietnam, and as more forces arrived in country, the new system went along with them. It was here the M1956 would finally see its first and arguably only large-scale usage in a wartime scenario. Over the next few years, it would be put to the test, and though it proved effective in that it was a lot more customizable and easy to use than previous gear, a number of problems arose, some small and others somewhat major. This led to a number of changes and updates to a variety of pieces that were seen throughout the conflict, and in some cases even afterwards. Now, before we continue with the macro elements of the system, let's take a look at the micro. For those curious about just the M1956 system as a whole, feel free to skip past this part. A chapter list can be found below, as we're going to break down the individual pieces and compare the various versions and alterations done to them. So let's begin with the pistol belt. Being seen in two sizes, medium and large, they were made to fit just about every waist size and then some, so they could be worn over things like flak vests, body armor, and cold weather gear. Overall, the design was kept the same when looking back at the M1936 and EX-54, but the main differences were that the belt could be adjusted from both sides, included 4 metal fasteners, and saw the removal of the button snap, which had been used to attach older .45 caliber pistol magazine pouches. All of these adjustments had more or less been done first with the EX-54s, which also featured a very unique square-shaped buckling system. These were seen in smaller numbers and evidently proved ineffective as they weren't seen in any form afterwards. The main buckle that was seen with the M1956s was a very similarly shaped one to the M1936 ones. However, where those had a sort of T-shaped male end, these ones featured a round ball-shaped one. A third type of buckle that was seen later on during the Vietnam War was the T-slot or Davis buckle variant. Named after the company that manufactured them, Davis Aircraft Products Company, these were an early attempt at a flatter, quick-release buckle. Seen on a small number of M1956 belts, they mainly appeared on its successor, the M1967. Though belts with these were used well into the 1970s by the National Guard, Reserve Forces, and for training purposes, they were short-lived in the field and were very susceptible to coming undone when in certain positions and were prone to snagging on foliage. The last bit with belts was that there were two styles as far as weaves. With just about all M1956s being made in canvas, they started out with a horizontal weave much like its predecessors, but as the years progressed, many more would be seen with vertical ones. Next up, we have the suspenders, often referred to as H suspenders due to their semi-rigid shape. These were seen in 3 sizes: regular, long, and extra long. Looking first at the EX-54 suspenders, one can see that they greatly diverge from older models, being a single, somewhat fixed item rather than 2 separate straps connected by way of a sewn-down tab. It did see new-style metal adjusters which featured a front flap that would be undone to loosen straps, then snap back down to keep them in place, along with metal loops at the top of the shoulder section, which allowed for the connection of ammo pouch support straps. Another interesting thing was that where older suspenders, such as the M1944, had snap hooks, these were basic welded metal ones. Now, the main difference between the EX-54 and M1956 was the removal of separate metal rings that were connected to the front hooks. These had been used to attach sleeping bag carrying straps, however they likely were prone to wear and damage along with unnecessary noise. Now, through the lifespan of the suspenders, the main changes seen were with the securing hooks, the other bit being padding added later on. First model suspenders had the same style welded hooks on both the front and back. Though they made sense to have on the front as it was easier to manage by the wearer, the back was prone to coming undone, causing problems. So second models, first seen in 1961, saw the back hooks change to the same ones seen with the M1944 snap hooks, while the design of the front hooks would remain unchanged, only seeing the metal altering to a flatter stamped shape. Finally, post-1970, many suspenders included padded nylon added to the underside of the shoulder area, obviously to improve comfort. Next up was a small pouch for either a first aid kit or compass. These were pretty straightforward but changed their looks going from a horizontal orientation to a vertical one. The EX-54 and first model M1956 saw a basic flap with a reinforced edge closed by way of a snap button. The second model, which came not long after, added the reinforced edge around the entire case, along with a metal drain hole at the bottom. Both versions were attached by way of a single slide keeper. Now are the ammunition pouches. From the start, these were a completely new concept, as instead of them being designed for specific magazines or clips, they were meant for ones of all shapes and sizes. It is worth noting though that EX models saw quite a number of versions that featured varying sizes, with larger ones presumably for taller magazines or linked ammunition. Single or dual-side straps that were either made of leather or canvas, used to hang items such as hand grenades, and a few different means to secure the front flap. When the M1956 finally came out, it included 3 features seen with the EX. They were the rigid box shape, a securing strap seen on the back, and finally canvas side straps. Skip forward to the first model, designated as Pouch Small Arms Ammunition Universal, saw single side tabs with snap buttons on the ends added to both, along with a single loop to allow 2 grenades to be attached. The method of opening, closing, and securing it was changed as well, now being lifted from quick release versions of British pattern 37 pouches seen in later years of World War II. This method was a simple one which featured 2 metal rings and a single canvas tab that fed through the 2 to close it. Very early versions of these included a small metal grommet at the end of the tab. Additionally, it included a double-layered canvas backing and a front reinforced plate inside of it, originally made out of a fiber and later on plastic, that served 2 purposes. The first was to keep the pouch stiff and prevent distortion, and the second as a sort of protector for the contents from things like shrapnel and other projectiles that may be kicked up during combat. Finally, a small drain hole was seen at the bottom of the pouch. The second model came out in 1962 and did away with the tab grommet, front reinforcement plate, which was replaced with thin plastic on the back and sides, and finally it was relabeled as case rather than pouch, along with doing away with universal from the title. By the mid-1960s, the M16 rifle was beginning to find its way into the hands of US forces inside of Vietnam. With a magazine capacity of 20 rounds but in a smaller caliber than the M14, the overall size of the magazines were a bit smaller and because of that sat lower in the pouches. Many forces simply stuck something in like socks, bandages, or whatever they could find to raise it up for easier and quicker access, but seeing this, a third and final version of the ammunition pouch was created in 1967. Known as the Case Small Arms Ammunition M16A1, this pouch simply was a scaled-down version of the second model seen only 5 years earlier. It didn't fully replace the older iterations, but simply supplemented them. Regardless of version, all 3 were secured by 2 slide keepers and included a securing strap on the back, which was intended to prevent wobbling and keep the pouches from sagging down, though quite often users simply cut those off as they frequently got in the way. Moving on, we have the entrenching tool cover. Between the EX-54 versions and the final M1956 iteration, not a whole lot was changed. Comparing the overall new design to the previous M1943, the main changes were the switching of the securing fastener going from a lift-the-dot style one to a snap button one, an added angled tab on the front with securing lower strap to attach the M8A1 scabbard used to carry the M5, 6, and 7 bayonets, and finally the replacement of the angled hook attachment to slide keepers. Now looking at early EX versions, a few were seen without some features such as the leather reinforced areas, which were added to provide an extra layer to friction-heavy areas. On to the next item, which was the field pack. These saw quite a few versions between the 2 systems. EX models played around with things like width, hand placement, the amount of slide keepers, side straps, and numbers of eyelets. 2 main models seem to have been prevalent, the 13 and 14, with the 14 being the one that would wind up as the basis for the final design. The M1956 version saw this iteration with many of the same features, which included a plastic top compartment on the flap to insert name tags or identification, 2 lower cross straps that could be used to attach items such as ponchos, a full top carrying handle, 5 eyelets on one side to attach older wire hook items such as machetes, smaller pouches, and bayonets, side loops which allowed users to connect additional M56 items such as canteens and ammo pouches, and finally a back loop that held the 2 slide keepers. However, issues with these soon arose as they were seen as a bit too small and had a few other minor problems that were quickly adjusted with the M1961 field pack. These were generally a little larger, allowing for extra space inside, the side flaps were removed as they were often inadequate and got in the way, and most importantly, a waterproof rubber liner was attached to the inside. perhaps the most unchanged aspect of this system was the canteen cover. Being based on the M1910 models, which had been in service one way or another for nearly 50 years at that point, the design had proven very effective. Aside from color and slight adjustments to stitching, the changes were minimal, seeing the attachment method updated, the inside lining being made of acrylic pile instead of felt, and the replacement of lift the dot to snap buttons as the primary closures. Starting off, these featured cotton trim and were used to cover the older metal M1910 canteens, but in 1962 these canteens were replaced with plastic ones, and come 1967 the cotton trim was updated to nylon. Now we've reached perhaps the most confusing, annoying, and weakest aspect of the M1956, the sleeping bag carrying straps. These in theory were supposed to be pretty straightforward, as they would be attached to the back of the suspenders and connected to other points for stabilization. The problem was they were often confusing to attach and use, and whenever the bag or whatever was inserted into them was removed, it would cause much or all of the webbing to become undone, leading to a bit of a mess. However, these were sometimes used creatively, being seen as multi-purpose carrying straps. Speaking of straps, one that was very useful was the field pack adapter. This U-shaped item allowed the pack to be worn towards the shoulders rather than on the belt by the waist. It was a quick adapter that helped redistribute loads in some cases and allowed the contents of the pack to stay dry in others. Finally is the universal individual load carrying sling. These were multi-purpose straps which featured a number of buckles and loops which could be used to attach and transport all sorts of items, from boxes of ammunition to mortar tubes and even other M1956 pouches. Okay, so those were the main components of the M1956 ILCE system. With the breakdown out of the way, let's resume its overall story. Each part had its benefits and detriments, and in many cases, small updates and changes were done to try and correct problems they faced. However, the system as a whole had a big problem: the material it was made out of. In the small pamphlet, heavy hints for light packs, and later on the manual Care and Use of Individual Clothing and Equipment, was a small section stating that the gear was to be used in, quote, hot, temperate, and cold, wet regions of the world. It is not for use in cold, dry, Arctic regions. This was later recanted, but the field manual went on to say how the gear should not be dried in the sun. The problem was that it was being constantly used in Vietnam, which had a very humid and wet climate. Throw in tons of rain during many months of the year, various rivers, ponds, lakes, rice fields, and so on, and you have yourself a bit of an issue, as equipment would often get wet and would dry in the sun. This led to warping and faster deterioration. The canvas material would also get heavy when waterlogged and cause equipment and items to become wet too. Overall, the cotton canvas was proving to be a bit of a problem, and so in the later half of the 1960s, a new system would begin being worked on called the M1967 MLCE, or Modernized Load Carrying Equipment, which was considered a sort of stopgap measure. Made up of nylon, this equipment was made specifically for tropical environments and was intended to not so much replace the M1956, but supplement it for the remainder of the war in Vietnam. Additionally, with the new M16 series of service rifles, pouches and other components were adjusted with the new magazine size and shapes in mind. While these two systems were being used, a more permanent one was being designed and developed by way of the Linclo and eventually Alice systems that would begin being issued in the later half of the 1970s. However, that itself is another story. So what happened to the M1956? Well, it stuck around for a little while longer, remaining in use by certain Army units into the 1980s. However, pieces of the system continued to be sporadically spotted well into the 90s. The system also made its way around the world, either in an original, modified, or cloned sense, seeing use by many of the Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia and Laos, along with many allied countries of the US such as Greece, South Korea, Australia, and numerous Central and South American countries throughout the remainder of the century. Today, modern US and even many global load-carrying systems are greatly different than they were 60 years ago. Though the systems nowadays are a lot more advanced, efficient, and user-friendly, their basic concept and design can be traced back to the M1956. Being the first universal and semi-modular one the United States created, it would be the first stepping stone for many to follow, completely changing the way soldiers carried much of their ammunition, gear, and equipment. Hopefully this video was enlightening and or entertaining to all who watched, and if so, why not give it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay informed of future uploads right here on Uniform History.